If you think it's time to take a hammer to your bathroom scale and rip up the diet rulebook, well, welcome to Body Kindness. Hi, everyone. It's Rebecca Scritchfield, author of Body Kindness and host for this podcast. I'm a health at every size dietitian, a certified exercise physiologist, a former chronic dieter, and mom to 2 girls. Join me as I talk to guests about what it means to be good to ourselves and create a better life where well-being matters, not weight. Through these conversations, we'll reveal the challenging and surprising ways our culture keeps us searching for our worth and our appearance. So let's create a new view of health that's inclusive and built on compassion and respect for all bodies. Let's shake things up and let's change the game. Hey, listeners, would you like to help advance research on body image healing? I'm co-investigator of a new study with Dr. Jennifer Webb, director of the Integrative Positive Psychology Research Lab in Mindfulness, Body Acceptance, Culture, and Health at UNC Charlotte. And we're looking for Body Kindness readers living in the U.S. to participate in a survey. If you're a woman who's currently pregnant or with at least one child under 5, and you are reading or have recently read Body Kindness, we would love to hear from you. Visit bodykindnessbook.com/research to learn more. Those who complete the survey will be eligible to receive access to an exclusive web-based body kindness training with downloadable resources for pregnant and postpartum women developed by me. Please help us spread the word about the research study by sharing the link on social media. That's bodykindnessbook.com/research. And if you haven't yet read Body Kindness, there are a limited number of free ebook copies available. Visit bodykindnessbook.com/research. If you have any questions, please email me, Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com.
This isn't just about race, but then when you bring that layer in, then you have a whole host of other issues, including, respect and issues of racism in the healthcare system and in the healthcare experience. I mean, Serena Williams, probably one of the most famous Black women in the United States, wrote about her experience giving birth last year, and that she had a blood clotting disorder, and that she knew that it was coming up postpartum, that she's had a blood clot, and the nurses were like disregarding her and not listening to her about what she needed until she finally was able to push them to give her the care she needed. But if Serena Williams can't even get the health care and can't even be respected by medical professionals, can you imagine, right? So, I mean, the problems are pretty vast, but race is definitely one of these through lines that you can see in terms of why are certain groups of people suffering the most. And it's a lot of it is about racism.
That was Miriam Zoila Pérez. Miriam is a queer Cuban-American writer and activist focused on race, health, and gender. In 2016, which is where I met her, she gave a TED Talk, How Racism is Harming Pregnant Women and What Can Help, which has been viewed over 850,000 times. That link is going to be in the show notes. Be sure to check it out because we don't rehash much of what is in the TED Talk. You will not want to miss what she shares about the JJ way in all the glorious detail in that video. So be sure to check that out. In addition to that amazing talk, she also wrote a piece in the New York Times, which I read in February 2018. And when I read that article, that's what prompted me to start reaching out and ask her if she would come on my series for women's health. And I'm so excited that she said yes. So that article is an opinion piece called Making Pregnancy Safer for Women of Color. And I will be sharing that link in the show notes as well. And once again, please make sure you read that so that you get the full impact of her wisdom, experience, and advice and ideas that she has to offer in addition to what we have in the show here. So what else would I like you to know about Miriam? So in addition to her TED Talk, Perez is a freelance journalist and the founder of Radical Doula. It's a blog that covers the intersections of birth activism and social justice from a doula's perspective. You can also catch her as one of the hosts on TONIC podcast, Healing Advice for What Ails You. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Splinter, Color Lines, The Nation, The American Prospect, More Magazine, Rewire.News, and Talking Points Memo. Perez's work has appeared in a number of anthologies, including Click, Yes Means Yes and Persistence, and Not That Bad, a New York Times bestselling anthology edited by Roxane Gay. Perez is the author of the self-published Radical Doula Guide, a political primer for full-spectrum pregnancy and childbirth support, which has sold over 2,500 copies. And I would highly encourage you to get your copy as well, whether you are a practicing doula, becoming interested in it, or whether you're considering it as an option for you. In our conversation today, we did not go deeply into the conversation of her experience as a doula. So you want to be sure to check out all of her amazing resources on her website. But she does have a radical approach to healthcare. And I really wanted to take some time to highlight these important resources, but then also get practical. So in our conversation today, you're going to hear us talk about toxic stress, what that is, how it builds up, the impacts that it can make on you as early as childhood. And then we talk about 3 core areas where her current research is focusing, where she sees as possible solutions. We basically acknowledge in the beginning that racism is an issue when it comes to the poor health outcomes for women of color, and that's a long-term solution. And we wanted to address that and acknowledge it, but then also talk about short-term answers as well. So you'll look for those 3 focus areas around social support, strong cultural connections, and racial identities, and also self-regulation skills and techniques, including what you can do as an individual. And it was such an interesting conversation. We seem to have many connections just through who we sit with in meditation and who we follow and look to, and just areas of research that overlap these disparities that we're seeing. So I hope that you get 1 or 2 helpful pieces of information from this conversation. And most importantly, I hope that you watch her TED Talk, read her work, support her podcast and her work, because I think it's very important and meaningful, and it definitely impacts women's health and well-being. Miriam, welcome to Body Kindness. It's so good to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to take a second to just let listeners know how I came to know of you and your wonderful work. And I discovered you live when I was in real life, as we would say, right? At TED Women in 2016. So you were one of the speakers who was selected, and your talk just blew me away. It was so timely, talking about racism and how it harms pregnant women.
Mm-hmm.
And everything you said was new information to me as a white woman with thin privilege. I had really not heard of anything that you had said. And I'm like, how can I be a health expert and helping professional and I don't understand these issues? So you woke me up.
Right.
And then once again in February, I read your article that you had in the New York Times that I hope we can discuss today as well. But yeah, it's for this series on women's health. I'm so excited that you agreed to come on and share what you do, what you know, so we can really help women of color have safer pregnancies. Can you share with the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Yeah. So my full name is Miriam Zoila Pérez, and I'm a writer and sort of like a health activist in a bunch of different ways. I have a background as a doula. I trained to be a doula in college and did a few years of volunteer doula work, both in kind of labor and delivery settings in a public hospital, but also supporting people during miscarriage and abortion in a different hospital setting. And then over the years, I've kind of focused my writing and my activism really on questions around race, health, and gender. So I'm not a practicing doula anymore, but I do other kind of work in the healing realm. I have a background as a massage therapist. And then my writing and my research is really focused on particularly the impact these days of racism on health and what we can do about it.
Yeah. And that was something that you said in your TED Talk, was that when you were doing some volunteer doula experience, that you literally got to witness firsthand the disparities that exist, which is basically race and class affect how you're treated, how much discrimination and stress you'll have in your pregnancy, which then can impact the outcomes of the health and safety of childbirth.
Right. And then really it's actually about the health, the racism you experience in your whole lifetime. So it's
Okay.
not just about it during pregnancy, but that's kind of what the growing body of research around the impact of racism on health shows, is that racism has an impact over a lifespan in sort of all the moments of discrimination, and also like the structural disparities that racism causes. But particularly, I'm focused on looking at the research around stress and how discrimination actually leads to sort of toxic stress that the body then responds with lots of health issues because of the toll that that takes. And so while toxic stress is experienced by people of all races and classes, it comes from traumatic experiences. It comes from instances where you don't have the coping mechanisms you need. Particularly, there's a lot of research about childhood and the impacts of that in childhood. We see a disproportionate impact on communities of color, particularly Black and Latino communities and Native American communities in the United States, because of racism and the impacts that it has.
And so it's something that builds up and amplifies. And then when you're talking about pregnancy being a vulnerable period for any woman, you've got this toxic stress that has built up, plus the discriminations that you would be facing during your pregnancy that could have an impact. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. So like the impact of the toxic stress is that it affects all of your sort of bodily systems, particularly your nervous system, but also your immune system and different things. And this is why, if you look at the research, the disparities in health and race cross all sorts of different types of health. So it's just, if you look at it in hypertension, if you look at it in heart disease, like there are African Americans especially experience much higher rates of these different diseases and challenges. And so more of the research and people are looking and saying this is about stress and the stress from discrimination. So yeah, pregnancy is one place, and maternal health and sort of outcomes is one place where we see it really, really amplified. For example, I talked about in my TED Talk that African American women are 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth than white women in the United States. Like, it's an incredible disparity. And the disparity actually continues even when you cross class lines. So oftentimes people say, well, that must be poverty. Well, it's not. That doesn't tell the whole story, because middle class Black women still have higher rates of things like maternal mortality, infant mortality, low infant birth weight, like the problems we see in birth, than their middle class white counterparts. So it's not just about class. Race is itself a huge factor. So that's where we start to point to things like the impact of racism on people's bodies and their well-being.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. Certainly you would think that in the United States, where, right, the best technology and everything that this is, the disparity has nothing to do with, we should be having safe pregnancies and we shouldn't have infant deaths. And yet we're in a situation where, based on differences in race, and like you said, it doesn't matter even if you have more money. I remember reading an article also in the New York Times that was an example of an African American woman who she couldn't get her healthcare providers to believe that her high blood pressure was causing her problems, and she was pregnant and she almost lost her baby, I think.
Right. Yeah. So, the United States spends more per capita on healthcare than any other country in the world. And we have pretty poor health outcomes. And that's not just about maternal health. Like, we have pretty poor health outcomes across health, factors that we can measure. But with maternal health, especially, it's pretty bad. And so, yeah, you have to ask yourself, well, and most people have access to healthcare. Most people are giving birth in hospitals, right? Like, it's not just about access to healthcare, although there are access issues. And so you have to start to ask yourself, well, what's going on? And there's a lot of layers there, including our approach to maternal health has some really big problems: over medicalization, interventions that can cause the problems of their own, like healthcare environments that aren't friendly. Like, this isn't just about race, but then when you bring that layer in, then you have a whole host of other issues, including, respect and issues of racism in the healthcare system and in the healthcare experience. Serena Williams, probably one of the most famous Black women in the United States, wrote about her experience giving birth last year, and that she had a blood clotting disorder, and that she knew that it was coming up postpartum, that she's had a blood clot, and the nurses would disregarding her and not listening to her about what she needed until she finally was able to push them to give her the care she needed. But if Serena Williams can't even get the health care and can't even be respected by medical professionals, can you imagine, right? So, the problems are pretty vast, but race is definitely one of these through lines that you can see in terms of why are certain groups of people suffering the most. And it's a lot of it is about racism.
Right. And so what is it? I mean, how do we even begin to tackle, I mean, I guess I would think that first acknowledging and saying, yes, this is a problem. And at the root of the problem is racism. I think getting white people to acknowledge that and own that is a necessary step, especially among healthcare providers. I mean, what would you say it's like we need to be able to do to make life better,
right,
for people of color?
Of course. I mean, obviously the biggest goal is to eliminate racism, right? So that has to be part of the approach. And racism shows up in everything from like the systems and structures that this country is founded on to the interpersonal interactions we have on a daily basis. So you have to take the sort of bigger approach. But, my research lately has been focusing on, well, what do we do in the meantime? It's going to take a long time to dismantle racism. It's a structure that has undergirded society for millennia. And we're in a moment, I think, politically where things are getting worse, not better, right? We have a government that's really enacting racism and acting in racist ways that are pretty much unchecked in this current moment, especially when we look at the treatment of immigrants. And so in the meantime, what do we do? Especially, I'm interested in, on an individual level, particularly for people who know that this is a factor in their life, or people of color who know that there's an impact of discrimination. And I will say that the research shows that discrimination broadly, even if it's not about race, does impact people's health negatively. So we can talk about lots of different populations that experience discrimination, from LGBT people to immigrants to folks with disabilities. So, there's research here that says that it's discrimination more broadly, but racism in particular, because the numbers in terms of outcomes for different groups are so stark. So I've been looking a lot at the research about, well, what interventions actually help people ameliorate the impacts of discrimination on their health, the impacts of racism, the impacts of toxic stress more broadly, because there's more research on that than on racism specifically. And so there's a few areas that research has pointed to. One of them is social support, which I think is intuitive to a lot of us, that having a strong social support network, people who are there for you, people who can be a supportive ear that can help you navigate difficult life situations, that has been shown to have a positive impact. And, that really connects to my background as a doula, that doulas, while are not, social support, I think they play that role for a lot of people in a professionalized context. But so that's a really important thing. And so what would it look like if we really prioritized social structures and things that really show, if we knew that social support was as beneficial as a medicine could be, how would that change our healthcare system, right? And that's the provider I talked about in that New York Times piece and in the TED Talk, Jenny Joseph. I think she really builds that into her model, her prenatal care model, which has been really successful at eliminating these disparities for the Black and Latino women that she sees. Social support is a part of the healthcare model. So the way the waiting room is set up, the way that they do education classes, the approach that they have for working with the clients, the ways in which her staff, including her receptionists and her nursing assistants, the way that they approach the healthcare really is this really supportive model that I think is mirrored in the research around social support. There's also more sort of granular things around self-regulation is an area that I've been researching a little bit lately. That is a set of skills that allow people to cope with difficult emotions and difficult life challenges. And there's research that shows that people who experience traumatic childhood experiences and toxic stress have more trouble self-regulating, but that we can also teach self-regulation the way that we might teach literacy. So there are these things that show us, that could be a model for really trying to intervene, particularly in communities where we know these kinds of discrimination and stress exist. So self-regulation. And there's a little bit of research about what does it look like to teach that to adults as well, which I'm interested in, not just working with kids. And then there's also a little bit of research about how having a strong racial identity and a strong cultural connection can actually help buffer the impacts of racism and discrimination. So there's a bunch of different kind of promising arenas around what people can do. Oftentimes, and I assume that probably a lot of people who listen to your podcast are white like you are, that one of the things I often say when people say, well, what do I do as like a well-meaning white person to like help with this issue? And I think one of the things people can do is really think about the ways in which racism exists in their daily life interactions. So microaggressions is like a term from the research about these like little minor moments that aren't these huge traumas, but that happen all the time to people of color. So, being treated a particular way at a store or a restaurant, being assumed to be, staff when you're actually faculty, or, different things like that, all these different kind of indecencies that happen on a daily basis. So those actually in this research about stress show that they can have a negative impact on people's health because they build up over time. Like even those little microaggressions, like you get kind of activated, your nervous system kind of kicks up. And so if that happens all of the time, it starts to really weigh on your health. So the corollary is that, well, if you know microaggressions are bad for people's health, for people of color's health, if white people can figure out how to intervene on their own biases, on their own implicit bias, on their own sort of programming based on being in this culture that is a racist society in many ways, if you can actually have an impact by not committing microaggressions, right? Like it actually matters. It's not just about politeness or political correctness, but this is like actually about the health and well-being of the people around you. So that's one thing that I try to talk about for people to think about, well, how am I interacting with people? And also, to get support and resources that are specifically anti-racist that can help people to work with some of that bias that's part of their programming.
Yeah, that's a lot of great information. I'm going to work backward from the microaggressions piece. Earlier this year, I had Ijeoma Oluo on, and we talked about her new book, So You Want to Talk About Race. And I think that was a really interesting and important conversation to get listeners thinking about privilege and microaggressions and how we can do better on an individual level. And I think the message there is that it's like once you see things, you can't unsee it, but also because of your privilege, you also have the privilege to get to ignore things. And so just encouraging listeners to re-listen to the podcast, read her book, and choosing to no longer ignore things that you can't unsee and understand from our conversations, right? Like what you're saying is like, this is an area where you can make a difference on your individual life and your homes and your communities that will help reduce the microaggressions that then help to reduce the toxic stress buildup. And it's a near-term actionable thing that we just need to choose to do a better job at. So I have that correct for you?
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly, one small thing, right? There's lots of bigger things, but I think it's an actionable thing to think about how you interact with people in your daily life, and how racism plays out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for those of us with, raising kids and everything like that, I think that there are lots of topics that are difficult topics that we might tell ourselves, oh, I don't know what to say, or I don't want to say the wrong thing, or it's too early or whatever. And whether it's teaching your girl, this is the clitoris, or, so proper terms about their body, or teaching about privilege and racism and why it matters. Like we've got to be able to figure out, like you can only take people as far as you have gone yourself. So especially if you have a job where you're raising kids, you need to be able to understand things better so that you can teach your kids how to live by better morals and values that then help give them the skills to also reduce microaggressions. Because I feel like a lot of times, and maybe it's each birthday that comes around, but I'm like, the kids are going to save us. I keep like looking to the future generations of Emma Gonzalez, just there is a certain energy that I do see in the power of resistance from younger folks. But at the same time, we can't give up on ourselves and our own jobs as parents.
Right. Yeah. And you're part of what shapes those kids and how they interact in the world and their beliefs. So yeah, that's there's definitely a lot of responsibility there.
Yeah. And then so working backward, I see an interesting intersection in your recent areas of research between the strong cultural connections and the social support system that you talked about, and in self-regulation abilities, because it's really reminding me of the research in positive psychology that talks about the power of human kindness and connection, and that those are also basic needs, and that there is strength and power and resilience in building a sense of cultural community. And when you can trust someone else, there's a support, a permission to be vulnerable, permission to ask for help and not like box that in, right? Which can then help to escalate. You have the exposure to stress, and then you have that sort of escalation of stress, which is then where I would see the self-regulation piece come in. If I understand what you're talking about that, right? It's like, so I'm good now, right? But I grew up like I didn't have health insurance until I had a health. What did I have in college? We had a health center, but like I never had a pediatrician. If something happened, I'd go to the emergency room with like broken arm or something like that. Or I remember I fell off the bike and got stitches. And we had a safe place to live, but we had some support through WIC for a few years, and so we had some food insecurity issues. And so there are still things today. It's like I get nervous if the fridge gets too empty. And I realize that that's not my present situation anymore, but it's a reminder of my trauma. And I've had to learn grounding techniques, emotion regulation techniques, and things like that from my poverty experience. And so just in those personal experiences, I'm sensing that that's what it's not the same thing because I'm just talking about poverty again. I'm white, but am I tracking correctly with what you're seeing there with how those things would work together for people?
Yeah. And I mean, the research really does include, in some ways focus on experiences like yours because they look more at like class than they do at race. A lot of the research about self-regulation, which I think is kind of a gap in the research that they're not looking at race as well. But poverty, things like food insecurity is considered an adverse childhood experience that can lead to toxic stress. And one of the sort of determiners they're finding as to what the impact of that is on you over the lifetime is your ability to self-regulate. So is your ability to manage the emotions. At this point, it's like your ability to manage sort of like the trauma response that you have from your past circumstances that are not your current circumstances. And to make the connection to parenting, one of the pieces around, it's called self-regulation, but it's actually not something we do only on our own. It's like when we aren't able to kind of manage a difficult emotion or some sort of stressor on our own, we look to people around us. So kind of, they're all connected. So it does go back to social support, but it also can go back to parental support. And so one of the things that they've seen is that the ability of the parent to self-regulate has a big impact on the ability of the child to self-regulate because the child both looks to the parent as like a role model for self-regulation and also relies on regulation from the parent themselves if they aren't able to handle the stress. So you comforting your child and helping them to kind of calm down when something difficult happens is part of their sort of coping and their ability to self-regulate well and to see kind of a better health outcomes over their lifetime. So all of these things happen in relationship and in community. And we can, like, if parents have better self-regulation skills, if we teach parents self-regulation skills, or even teachers perhaps, or other caregivers that don't have to be parents, other important caregivers, then that strengthens the child's ability to also self-regulate and do what you just said about opening the fridge as an adult, realizing what's coming up for you and kind of finding techniques to bring yourself back down to sort of the reality of your current moment and not get lost in the trauma response that it's eliciting, right? So it's exactly it.
Yeah. And then, but taking that back to what, like the Serena Williams, right? Like she could also be in a situation where her present experience is a traumatic experience. So how the ability to self-regulate in that situation, which I'm going to make some guesses, you can guide me, right? But it's like, wait a minute, I am not the problem. The system is the problem. This is discrimination. This is racism. They're not hearing me. How can I keep engaged in my rational brain and keep asking for what I deserve and care so that my needs are met?
Right. And that's where it comes to like, you need the individual interventions and you need the systemic intervention. So the systemic intervention there is very much, we have to figure out how to remove racism from healthcare. We have to figure out how to train healthcare providers differently so that they don't treat Black patients differently than white patients. And the healthcare model in general is not very patient-centered in a lot of ways. So, that experience of not being listened to as a patient is also something that people experience across privilege, but it particularly is amplified when you bring in, marginalized communities. So that's a piece of it. And then, people have to figure out how to tolerate the stress and trauma that comes from these daily life experiences that, continue into adulthood whether it's poverty or, the impact of discrimination and racism. So it's kind of has to be a both. And what are the coping mechanisms that help you to recover from a traumatic or stressful experience that is in your present day, or that brings up your past? I mean, sometimes it's both, right? That it could be the two things at once. What are the things that, we need to do as a society to address the root causes of these problems? It's not just on individuals to manage the stress of discrimination, right? We have to figure out how to remove it altogether.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that with our eyes on the longer term picture, being able to, I guess, label the current realities correctly. So like there are problems in the medical system, but also even the issue of the power dynamic between doctor and patient, right? I mean, I think that there's this belief they must be smarter than me. They must know everything there is. It's almost like gaslighting. I don't know if that would be an appropriate use of it, but it's like they must know. And then you start to question whether or not what you're feeling is real and true.
Real. Yeah.
So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think and that's, some of the roots I have in like the doula work and like birth activist work is about that, right? Is about really questioning the medical model that really prioritizes the knowledge and experience of the provider over the knowledge and experience of the patient. But the patient is the one living in the body, right? It's like you have all of this information from your bodily experience, but we prioritize the test results and the doctor's expertise. And I think that's a really backwards model, and that it should be a partnership between the two people. It's like you have this knowledge about your body. I have this knowledge about the medicine and the science and these test results. How do we come together to figure out what's going on? And that's not rooted in our approach at all. It's not rooted in the hierarchy of medical systems. Doctors aren't necessarily taught that perspective at all. We weed pre-med students out based on their knowledge of organic chemistry, not their knowledge of empathy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like so many places where we could intervene that could potentially change that experience for everybody, not even just people who are marginalized, but then you add that on top of it and you get even more paternalism or more mistreatment. And so, yeah, there's just so many places that we need to improve and look to some of the other models. Like, nursing has some roots in a more sort of patient-centered model. Midwifery and nurse midwifery have some of those roots. And so how can we learn from those approaches to really, transform the way that our healthcare system works? Because, we spend lots and lots of money and we have a lot of sick people. Like it's really not working what we're doing. And so I think a lot of it is at the root of how patients feel. And I mean, the stress of just going to the doctor, like how many people feel like that's a stressful experience, right? And stress matters, like it has an impact on your health, right? So it's kind of baffling when you really start to think about it. But yeah, how do we change those environments so that they're supportive environments, not stressful ones? Like these are supposed to be health places that make us healthy,
Yeah. Well, and I've been reading some recent research on healthcare avoidance. So it's mostly related to a model correlating body mass index with experience and internalized weight bias, which then led to healthcare stress. And the healthcare stress was the mediating variable that then led to healthcare avoidance. And so I'm looking at this model and I'm just like, okay, so what we need to be looking at is how do we reduce the experience of healthcare stress? Because that is what is helping somebody say, oh no, I don't want to go to the doctor. It's not because people don't care about their health and well-being.
No.
It's they don't want to have to deal with the stress of showing up to their appointment.
Right. Or being fat shamed, right?
Yes.
Or being told that whatever problem they have is about their body size and not actually a health problem, not a problem that's solvable, right? Like just make your body smaller and then this problem will go away. I mean, it's absurd. So, and even for people who aren't quote unquote overweight, right? There's still so much stress. And then again, right, you add in elements like race and class and you're much more likely to deal with healthcare avoidance. So yeah, I think it's a huge problem that even people with privilege can probably relate to a certain degree, that it's hard to find a provider that where you feel like you're heard and respected. And so, yeah, why would you go to the doctor? And is it even going to help you? So yeah, there's lots of approaches that we need to be taking on.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe kind of flip it to maybe some solutions, right? I mean, we sort of started teasing them out, but one idea that I wanted to bring up, and I want to preface this by saying, I don't fundamentally believe that if you just take a bubble bath, it will solve all your problems. But when you talk about self-regulation, I can't help but think about the power of breathing. I can't help but think about what I've learned from Sharon Salzberg and mindfulness and meditation and loving kindness meditation and activities like these that are free. They require your time. But what would you say to self-care practices like mindfulness and meditation, like even before you think you need it, so that you could use it to self-regulate when you were, in a stressful situation?
Right. Yeah, the good news is like everything pretty much I've mentioned, like I didn't make any things up. These are things that people are doing and intervening. So the good news is that people are trying lots of different things and are finding out what works. So that's the good news, is that we're not starting at square one. Like the problems are big, but lots of people are trying to come up with solutions and are coming up with solutions. I mean, people are incredibly resilient as well. So yeah, meditation has been a big tool for me. I struggle with anxiety. So, the first therapist I saw like 12 years ago was like, hey, meditation is like, one of the things that's proven to help with anxiety. So I've been in my own meditation practice for most of that time, and also kind of part of some Buddhist communities around meditation. And I've sat with people like Sharon Salzberg. So it's definitely something that I find helpful for myself. And it can be, as simple as, just taking a moment to feel your breath in your body. And I think that kind of body awareness is like the beginning step for anybody who's trying to think about improving their health and their stress coping is noticing what happens in your body, so you even know when you're getting to that point of being, activated or being stressed out, so that you can try and intervene with whatever things work for you. So yeah, for some people, taking a bath is a huge help. It's definitely a tool I've used. And yeah, I think self-care can get commodified and made into a luxury item. But most people have access in the United States to, running water. So a warm shower, a warm bath, like those things can be a really accessible tool that you can use. But I think the key is like, you have to have enough awareness of your body. Like, you have a lot of awareness of your body to know when you open that fridge, that feeling that, there's an emotion, but there's also a body feeling, I imagine. Does your face get flushed? Does your heart start racing? Are you sweating? Like, these are all very embodied expressions of distress and stress and sadness, all those things. So for me, a lot of it's very individual. Like everybody's going to have a different experience of what is, somatics is another arena that's looking at this kind of intervention. And they talk about resourcing, right? So what are the resources that, when you're kind of getting upset, can help you to, be present with that and not kind of let it escalate to the point where it's not tolerable for your body, or that it lasts a really long time. So yeah, meditation is definitely one of them. But it could be anything. It could be, a good book. It could be talking to a friend or a family member. It could be taking a walk. It could be looking at the trees. That there's no definition of what a resource is, except that it helps you and calms you and helps you to feel better. And the way the nervous system works, right? It's like it's responding to what it feels like is a threat to your sort of well-being. And most of the time, the things we're talking about are not actually those kinds of threats. They feel that way and they bring that response, but they're not actually threats to your well-being. And so how do you intervene so that the nervous system doesn't kind of go all the way to that place where there's so much adrenaline because you're ready to run, from whatever the threat is. So
yeah,
we are very cognitive society. We're very intellectual, but a lot of this is actually about the body and what are we kind of getting really good at knowing ourselves and knowing our physical responses, and then figuring out what helps to mitigate that.
Yeah. And just how the emotional can influence the rational. So the emotional feelings can influence rational choices, which can build up over time in either positive ways or negative ways. So in body kindness, I talk about spiraling up as more of a positive, open, connected way of being. But also when we're not wanting to feel our negative emotions, or we're not wanting to be in that bad place, that it could lead to choices that actually make you feel more closed off and disconnected from others, which you had brought in the very beginning, the value and importance of connection and support and everything like that. And then I know you don't have much more time for the rest of our conversation, but to kind of capstone besides that on that personal level. So building a regular self-care practice, including deep breathing, meditation, some self-care experiences that you can use. It sounds like, based on what we talked about, the other options are, as much as you have control over where you get care, being able to maybe make decisions about the type of care you're getting. So with your experience as a doula, and you talked really eloquently before about having proper setups and things like that. So just encouraging people to try to find an environment that seems like they're going to have their needs met, and maybe even care providers that, are from their own race. Like, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing is you just have to listen to yourself. Like, where do you feel comfortable? Like, where do you feel at ease? Like, where do you feel heard? And that's going to differ for everybody from one person to another. But yeah, there is definitely a sense of being able to go to a provider who looks like you could lessen the impact of things like microaggressions or, racism or discrimination, although it's not, a guarantee necessarily. And that's a challenge because there's a real diversity issue among healthcare providers, right? That the vast majority of people are white. So for me, the biggest thing is just listen to yourself. Like, where do you feel supported? And then what can you do to help increase that feeling of support? Whether it's bring a friend with you to the doctor's office. I did that recently. So I was going to sort of an appointment I was nervous about, and I was like, I want to have somebody there to support me. So, you can bring a friend with you, you can bring a partner with you, you can bring a family member with you. Like, you can kind of try to do things that shape your own well-being in these contexts. And if, you're a provider who's not supportive of that, if you're able to switch providers, you should do that, right? So as much agency as you have, trying to really listen to what one of the things that, people say in kind of the healing spaces is like, follow the healing, like follow the health. Like, where do you feel well? Like, where do you feel supported? Like, and how can you listen to that information as a way to try and increase sort of your well-being? So we often focus on like what's not working and what's ill and where our sickness is, but we can also kind of balance that by looking toward where we feel well as well in our lives. So I think that it's a very individual decision, and there's a lot of things that limit people's choices around it, but kind of what's best for you, and if you can really listen to the signals your body's giving you about who makes you feel comfortable and supported and who doesn't.
Mm-hmm. And that you're worth advocating for what you want and need. And I love the idea of bringing a friend. I haven't thought of that one before. I'll usually talk to people about, let's think about it and like write a letter out about the type of care you want and what's important, even if you never hand it over, but just the act of writing it out.
Right.
Yeah.
Bring a friend. Why not? Right.
Yeah.
Like it's not normalized necessarily, but maybe it should be. Right. So that's the little things that we can do to give ourselves the support we need to navigate challenging situations.
Yeah. Well, before we go today, can you please share how people can get in touch with you? I will include the link to your TED Talk. That's wonderful. Everyone listen to that. And the February New York Times article. But if there's anything else, how people can follow you or find you or get in touch with you or your research, I'd love for you to share that with them.
Sure. Yeah, folks can find me on Instagram and on Twitter at Miriam Z Perez, and maybe you can include those links as well. If you want to follow kind of my reading and my work and my writing. I have an account on Facebook and a blog called Radical Doula that talks about a lot of the origins of this work in my world. And I also wrote a book that I self-published called The Radical Doula Guide that's written really for doulas who are looking for a political education around things like race and class and the structures that shape our lives, because it's not common in doula trainings, but lots of other people have used it as a sort of just a political education around maternal health specifically, and these different kind of structures and systems that shape people's experiences. So that's another thing that folks can find on my website, radicaldoula.com.
That is so fabulous. I can imagine that, like you said, doulas needing to purchase and get benefit from that book, but also just anyone who might be considering a doula. Again, that we kind of should on ourselves in our minds of like, oh, I should just trust the medical system and da-da-da. And I think that you've offered plenty of reason why we should really stop and think about what we want that will be a good fit for us and what we trust. So
Oh, and definitely. Thank you. And one last plug. I have a podcast, actually. I mean, I have two podcasts. One is about Latinx music. So if you're interested in music, specifically by Latino artists, it's called Radio Manea. So it's different than your audience, but it's very fun. Lots of joy. The other one is actually about healing. It's called TONIC, and it's a healing advice podcast. And it's me and 2 other healers of color, Rochelle Faithful and Karen Culpepper. And we answer questions. So people send us questions about healing and we answer them. And we all have really different backgrounds in terms of our modalities and our experience levels. So that's another place that folks who listen to your podcast might enjoy to hear more about alternative healing, and particularly from kind of an activist and POC-centered experience.
Oh, that's fabulous. I really appreciate that. I'll make sure to include links to both of those podcasts in the show notes.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And that's a wrap on today's show. Let's continue the conversation on Facebook. Just search Body Kindness Podcast and click to join. And if you can contribute to the production costs for the 2018 podcast season, visit gofundme.com/bodykindness. We love ratings and reviews. Please do that. And don't forget to let your friends know that Body Kindness is one of your can't miss podcasts. If you have questions, comments, or guest recommendations, shoot me an email, Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com.